Hello and welcome to our new video on relative clauses. In this video, we'll first look at what a clause is and then continue with relative clauses. You'll see examples of relative clauses with different relative pronouns and also the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Meanwhile, you'll be doing some practice. First of all, it's important to understand what we mean by a clause. A clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb, and it is usually part of a sentence. Let's see an example. You have already studied noun clauses, so this sentence will be familiar to you. The players don't know how they lost the game. In this sentence, how they lost the game is the noun clause, and it has a subject and a verb within itself. Here is another example. If I have time this evening, I'll watch the movie Overboard. As you can see, the if clause in this sentence has a subject and a verb too. So please keep in mind that a clause has a subject and a verb. Alright, what is a relative clause then? A relative clause is a dependent clause, and it is used to describe or give extra information about the noun in the main clause. It is also called an adjective clause because it describes a noun. We use relative pronouns to introduce relative clauses. Relative pronouns who, which, and that can be used as the subject of the relative clause. Let's see an example. The sentence, "The man is my uncle," is not very clear in meaning because, as you can see in the photo, there are a few men. So which man are we talking about? We need to describe the noun man. The man who is talking to the driver is my uncle. We describe the noun man with the relative clause who is talking to the driver. And the relative pronoun who is used as the subject of the relative clause. We can also use that instead of who. Here is another example. To describe the noun woman, we use the relative clause who visited my mother yesterday. In the next example, we need to describe the noun books because it's weird this way. All the books in the world? Definitely not. She has read all the books which were written by Garcia Marquez. Here again, which or that is the subject of the relative clause. As you can see in these examples, the relative clause can be in the middle or at the end of a sentence, depending on where the noun we want to describe is. We can use the relative pronouns whom, who, which, and that as the object of the relative clause. In our first example, we need to describe the noun person to make the meaning clear. So, the relative clause whom I wanted to see describes the noun person. We can say that whom is a formal usage and it can be used instead of an object. Who or that can also be used in this case. Here, we see the noun we describe, our relative clause, and whom as the object of the relative clause. When this is the case, we must have a subject in the relative clause. So, we can omit the relative pronouns and say, the person I wanted to see wasn't in his office. In this slide, you can see how the relative pronoun is used to replace an object. Let's look at another example. You can easily say that we need to describe the noun movie in this question. What was the name of the movie which you were talking about? As we use the relative pronouns which or that to replace the object, we can omit them from the relative clause. Now it's your turn. Please pause the video and describe the nouns in bold with a relative clause using the information in the second sentence. When you are done, play the video and check your answers. Alright, here are the answers. You can pause the video again if you need more time to check your answers. Now, we can go on with the relative pronoun whose. We use whose to replace a possessive adjective or a possessive noun. Here is an example. To describe the noun story in this sentence, we replace the possessive adjective its with whose and say, an interesting story whose messages surprise people. In our next example, the possessive adjective his is replaced with whose to describe the noun aviator with a relative clause. There was an aviator whose plane crashed in the desert. And in this last example, we need to describe the noun woman. So, we use the relative clause just after the noun woman and use whose to replace the possessive adjective her. The woman whose children needed money had to sell her flat. Now, let's look at how we use the relative pronoun where. We use where to describe a noun of a place when the meaning is there. Here is an example. This is the restaurant where we eat lunch every day. The meaning here is we eat lunch there or at that restaurant. So, we use where to give that meaning. In our second example, we describe the noun park. The meaning is we go for a walk there or in that park. So, we say the park where we go for a walk. In the next example, the noun city is described and the meaning is I grew up there or I grew up in that city. So we say the city where I grew up. You should be aware that an appropriate preposition with the relative pronoun which or that can be used instead of where. Now, let's see an example. This is the room where he sleeps. When you use the appropriate preposition in, we have the following alternatives. This is the room in which he sleeps. This is a formal usage, and you can only use which, because the preposition is used first. When you use the preposition at the end of a relative clause, you have the alternative that, or you can simply omit the relative pronoun, but keep the preposition in the sentence. Here is another example. I liked the hotel where we stayed. We usually say stay at a hotel, so the appropriate preposition here is at. So we can say the hotel at which we stayed. Or we'll have the following alternatives if we use the preposition at the end. Another point is you need to be careful about whether to use which or where after a noun of place. Now, look at these examples. The difference between these two sentences is that in the first sentence, the meaning is it is opposite our house. And in the second sentence, the meaning is we play football there. So in the first sentence, we use which to replace it. And in the second, we use where to replace there. The relative pronoun when, on the other hand, is used to describe a noun of time. Here is an example. My grandfather never forgets the day when he came to this country. In this example, we describe the noun day. It's a time word. so we use when in the relative clause to describe it. As an alternative, we can use that, and we can omit the relative pronoun. Let's look at another example. Emma joined the company in the year when she graduated from college. The noun we describe here is year, so we use when or that, or we can simply omit it. Now it's your turn. Pause the video and complete the sentences with an appropriate relative pronoun. When you are ready, you can see your answers on the next slide. Here are the answers. You see that the relative pronouns that can be omitted are given in parentheses. Here, I'd like to point out number 7, which is a bit tricky. In number 7, you'll see that there is a preposition, so you cannot use where. That's why the answer is which or that, or you can just omit the relative pronoun. In the last part of this video, we'll see the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Defining relative clauses say who or what we are talking about. In other words, we need defining relative clauses to make the meaning clear. Here is an example. When you hear or read this sentence, you may ask, which or what bag? By using a relative clause, we make the meaning clear. The bag which she bought yesterday. In the second example too, you may ask questions like where, when, what person are you talking about? Our relative clause here defines and makes clear what we mean by the only person. The only person that supported me at the meeting. Non-defining relative clauses, in contrast, don't say who or what we are talking about because it's already clear. They just give extra information. As you see in this example, when someone says the mayor, it's already clear who they are talking about. So, the relative clause in this sentence gives extra information. Even if we omit the relative clause from the sentence, the meaning is still clear. And in the second example, the relative clause gives extra information about Istanbul. Please pay attention that if the non-defining relative clause is in the middle, we use it between commas. If it is at the end of a sentence, we use a comma before it and finish the sentence with a period. Here are some more examples. Please note that you cannot use the relative pronoun that in non-defining relative clauses. You cannot omit a relative pronoun either. The last point about non-defining relative clauses is that we can use them to talk about an entire sentence. Now look at these examples. As you can see, the non-defining relative clauses here do not describe a specific noun, but they refer to the whole sentence. In this kind of relative clauses, we can only use which as the relative pronoun. It's your turn again. Read the sentences and decide whether the relative clauses in these sentences are defining or non-defining, and put commas where necessary. Now you can pause to think about your answers. Here are the answers. In the second and third sentences, we have defining relative clauses. The others are non-defining. Please check the following out for further study and practice. This is the end of our video. Goodbye.